So one quick thing on Canvas, I will be putting up the quiz for Hinduism later today. Apologies for the delay, but there had been an issue with the lecture video on Thursday, and because I like to make sure students have access to all available tools and resources for taking their quizzes, I want to postpone putting the quiz up there. You will have until the end of next week, though, to work on the Hinduism quiz, so that's a plus. We are working on Buddhism today, though. So, just as a note, on or from the homepage, if you click on Eastern religions, you scroll down, it'll say Buddhism. It has a required video, which ideally you will have already watched, but if not, please watch it by Thursday. There will be a group activity in class on Thursday so that I can find out if you have watched the video and that you have read the chapter. The PowerPoint that is being used is also available there. All right, so Buddhism. When we learn Hinduism, one of the questions that you were asked is whether or not Hinduism is a single religion. And the answer was no. It's a whole bunch of different groups that have similar concepts and ideas that are bound together through those ideas, such as the wheel of samsara, reincarnation, deities such as Brahman or Vishnu or Shiva. In Buddhism, there is a single not creator, but a single initial teacher of Buddhism. So we have a founder, which we didn't have in Hinduism. However, similar to Christianity, Buddhism is also not just one group. There are hundreds and hundreds of forms of Buddhism. We will talk about three or four major forms of Buddhism, but the fact is, as Buddhism spread every place it went, it became slightly different. And so if you go even to a single place, take for instance, if you go to Burma. In Burma, depending on which temple you go to, you get completely different ideas about how Buddhism is celebrated and how Buddhism may have grown together with other traditions to include other types of images or what types of depictions of Siddhartha you might come across. In another portion of Burma, you get other temples and other types of designs. So every place Buddhism went, it became a little bit different. But unlike Hinduism, we can say that there is a single founder, which does help us come down to some of the core teachings or the core fundamentals. Now, there's a number of different images associated with Buddhism. Some of these you've probably seen before. The lotus flower, as we mentioned, is part of Hinduism, but it's also present in Buddhism. In Buddhism, lotus flower, rather than just this idea of aesthetically pleasing or beauty, the emphasis is on purity and how the lotus flower brings us to the sense of or understanding of purity. So there's a lot of depictions of the lotus flower being used in parts of Buddhism that show up in Indonesia, in India. You do see it in China as well, but not quite as often as those other countries. Now, if you've ever been to a Thai restaurant, you might have seen images of the two golden fish. Another image that is popular throughout many different forms of Buddhism, it represents perseverance, the idea of being able to conquer and to continue on. The depiction of the fish being also in balance with one another. So it's a pair of them. Above that is the precious umbrella. It may not be seen regularly, but it is for Mahayana Buddhism and the offshoots of Mahayana Buddhism a rather important symbol. It shows up in sand mandalas, where, especially mandalas that are designed for health. You'll see depictions in such mandalas of yogis or of the precious umbrella representing this sense of health, protection. When they created the mandala a couple years ago at the Museum of Fine Art, the monk put the different precious umbrellas in 4 different areas and explained how the idea was that, in part, the mandala being a mandala for healing for the Tampa Bay region, and so that would be why it was used. Now, we did have the yantra in Hinduism, but in Buddhism you have the endless knot. It doesn't necessarily promote the notion of oneness the way that yantra did, but it's still this intertwining of compassion and wisdom. The idea that ultimately everything is interdependent or interconnected in some way. What's interesting is how the endless knot might show up in some of the practices. In certain times of the year, depending on the Buddhist tradition, you might see where you go to a temple and there will be these strings that are tied from the main statue of the Buddha to all different parts of the temple and then woven back and forth, essentially creating what's sometimes actually referred to as Indra's web. Indra, of course, being an ancient Hindu god, but the idea comes through into Buddhism. But the idea of these knots is that they represent this intertwining of wisdom and compassion, and also represent an ability to ask for blessings from the Buddha or from the universe, in the sense that people will often take prayers or thanks or other items and connect it to where there is a knot on these strings. The last image are the Buddha wisdom eyes. This goes to the story of when Siddhartha received his revelation, when he experienced Nibbana, or Nirvana as we are familiar with the term. In this sense, seeing with the Buddha eyes is seeing existence as it is and isn't at the same time. Being able to see beyond the illusion. And being able to see compassion and love as well. As a note, according to 2014 estimates, there are over 480 million adherents. More so than even with Hinduism. People sometimes question these numbers, especially in places in the West, especially places such as the United States, because a lot of people, again, will look at all of the Eastern religions and see them not as religions, but as spiritualities or as philosophies. And because a person generally can be one of these Eastern religions and something else at times, it makes it to where they might not be putting their religion down on a census. Yes?
Who did, in the book, in the
Workbook, yeah.
I read Buddhism is the fourth large religion, making up roughly 7.1%. When was it?
That was 2016. So the PowerPoint is slightly older. So yeah, it has grown. It's actually growing even more. Really, the better numbers will be probably in about 2021, 2022 is when we'll have better, more accurate numbers for all the world religions, because a lot of countries do their census reports every 10 years, and then it's usually about 1 to 2 years after that that you start getting all of the data extracted into percents. So a lot of countries do their census reports every 10 years on 10, so 2020. All right, so Buddhism. Now, this is where it gets slightly complicated the more you delve into it. So, based on your reading, is there a general worldview? It's hard to come up with one. If you take a look, where is the yes, I know. That's why I'm choosing. There should be a page that has the fundamental features summary.
Like Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, so we have Four Noble Truths, that's a key. What does it say here for that first one?
Basic worldview. Reality is an indescribable unit. Humans find themselves in a realm of suffering governed by karma.
So the worldview, we have an indescribable reality. We have something we can't quite understand or put into words, but it in some sense exists. It's governed by something called karma. And we go through this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, which is called the wheel of what again? No, samsara. Now, if we look in the other textbook, and you go to page 188, we have another thing. How should we live in this world? Or what is ultimate reality? So we'll look at ultimate reality first. All right, if someone else will be able to read the how should we live in this world in a moment, that would be great. So what is ultimate reality? Buddhists often use the Sanskrit word Dhamma in its broader sense, that is, as nature and its laws, to refer to ultimate reality, or reality as it is, rather than as it is usually perceived. According to the doctrine of interdependent origination, reality is a web of interrelated and interdependent phenomena in which nothing comes into existence independently of other things. Instead, the origination or coming into existence of things depends on all other things, as does their continued existence. All things are constituted of elements of other things. Nothing exists in and of itself. Does that clear things up for you? Not really. It is difficult to really try to come in and have something that we can say, this is how Buddhists see the world. This is how they understand something of the ultimate. So, how should we live in this world? Somebody read that section.
Where would I find that in the other book?
It is, should be around page 188,
That goes into another chapter.
then maybe like 185, a couple pages before. It's the last pages of the Buddhism chapter. All right, thank you.
Believing that there is stability and permanence in the world, we should seek to possess what we want and to avoid what we do not want. Our inability to do so results in suffering that arises from our ignorance of the true nature of reality. Accordingly, the Buddha's guide to life, the Noble Eightfold Path, begins with the acceptance of a correct view of reality. The importance of striving for goals consistent with this understanding and living according to corresponding ethical principles follows. Finally, the Eightfold Path enjoins Buddhists to cultivate awareness and concentration that leads to enlightenment and an end to suffering.
So here we learn that there's a focus on, to understand the worldview, to understand what the ultimate is also to understand the Eightfold Path, which also means you understand the Four Noble Truths. You understand that there's a goal of something called nibbana or nirvana, which is not a physical place except for one or two, a handful of devotional forms of Buddhism, such as Jodo or Pure Land Buddhism. For them, nirvana is a place, but otherwise, nirvana is not heaven. It's something else that's also indescribable. So we have nirvana, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path. We have the Wheel of Samsara, so we have karma involved. Now, there's one other key term that gets involved with understanding the worldview, and that's tathata. Tathata means thusness, or the moment, or momentariness or momentariness of existence, meaning this moment right here. If remember, when we're talking about world-embracing or world-denying religions, Buddhism is both our most world-embracing and most world-denying at the same time. Because the only thing that exists is this moment. Now, if you observe the moment, you're no longer in the moment. It's now a new moment. We'll come back to this idea to help understand nature of existence, but all of these things, along with something called the void, which is an empty space, if you will, is how best to describe something that, even in your book, is seemingly undescribable. So there's a bunch of different terms and ideas. There's not a core, complete concept. Did any of you think the ultimate power in Buddhism was Buddha? It looks that way sometimes, especially if you look at things like devotional Buddhism, where you see that merely saying Nama or praise be gives you the status of Buddhahood. If one merely sings his name, even in a small voice, he has reached Buddhahood. But that's in devotional Buddhism, and even there, it's technically not worship of Buddha. Buddha is not an ultimate power. He was a human being who became enlightened, who achieved nirvana, who taught something, which, by the way, was not called Buddhism. Buddhism, as a religion, develops later. What he taught was called the middle way, or the middle path. It was between a path of strict asceticism and a path of being a warrior noble. Back to that in a minute. Origin, destiny of the world. Do we get any answers? Not really. Textbook doesn't quite approach these questions. Why? Because they're not important questions. Taoism, we will see this long explanation of how we don't know. In Hinduism, we had the phrase that, who knows for certain. Right. Buddhism, Siddhartha, when asked by one of the monks to explain the unanswerable questions, came back with a great response. Siddhartha regularly spoke in parables. And to understand the nature of origin or destiny of the world, he gives a parable. Let's say there is a man who's struck by a poisoned dart, and he lay on the ground, beginning to die. But a physician was procured for him. However, the man told the physician and his friends, I will not allow you to save me until I know the name of the person who shot me with the arrow. I will not allow you to heal me until I know which clan the person was from, what color tone of the skin the person had, what age the person was. Goes through all these things. And then Siddhartha asks the monk, what would happen to such a man making these requests? He'd die without ever even knowing the answers.
When you got done asking all those questions, you would let out.
Exactly. Most simply, such questions are not important. If we summed it up, in Buddhism, the idea could be stated as knowing how the world was created or what's going to happen to the world millions of years from now really should not change how you live your daily life. You live your daily life according to these precepts, according to these ethics and ideas, not because one person or one entity or one explosion created or didn't create the world. To go into those questions only causes suffering, according to Buddhist thought. There's one little exception to it, but we're going to hold off on that. Origin of humans. Who knows? Somehow karma is involved, but that doctrine of interdependent origination means everything comes from something
It's like the chicken and the egg.
Right, and you know what, again, how the origin happened doesn't really matter. But destiny of humans, oh, totally different story. There are a lot of teachings, and depending on the form of Buddhism, those teachings number in the hundreds almost. In Buddhism, if you watch the video, for those who watch the video, according to the actress, does Buddhism have ideas or teachings on hell?
Yeah.
Not according to the lady in the video. The lady in the video says, I don't even think they have any teachings on it.
I was reading about the Garden of Hell.
Ah, exactly. Garden of Hell in Thailand. I'll try and get a small PowerPoint of some of the pictures of that garden up because I'm not going to have time to do it today. My friend got to visit the one, like 2 or 3 different gardens of hell in Thailand. And there are a lot of stories. There are a lot of beliefs. It is a garden of statues that you probably would not enjoy going to. Depictions of hell rival. No, they go further than any depiction of hell found in a Western religion. There's a story, and I'll try and get the actual image that shows the story. A man, was known for lying in life, constantly told lies. His words were like swords that pierced into other people. Gossip, lies, hurting people, etc. So he dies, and he's taken down to one of the lower levels of hell. Depending on the form of Buddhism, there's anywhere from 7 to 14 layers of hell, depending on the form. So he's taken down to one of these lower levels, and he screams out in agony. So they pour molten rock down his throat, which then burns and dissolves his body. But then it's immediately reformed, to which his screams are now piercingly loud. So they take shards of ice, and the shards of ice pierce his throat to the point where it detaches his head from his body, only to be reformed again, to have the molten rock reformed, and it's seemingly an eternity. Now here's the trick with Buddhism, and it's part of why even the woman in the video says there aren't many teachings on it, despite the fact that there are plenty. Hell also doesn't exist in Buddhism. Anyone ever hear the phrase, you create your own hell? Mm-hmm. That you do things over and over again that you know are not good for you, but you just keep doing them? Mm-hmm. Or that if you see the world a certain way, that's the way it's going to appear? It's similar to that type of a notion. You are attached to your karma. So the guy was attached to all the pain and suffering he caused. Thus, he received that pain and suffering in return. As soon as he detaches from that entity that no longer exists, meaning the person who lived and did those things, by detaching from it, he is freed of it, and thus goes back into the wheel of samsara and is born again. Lower level being most likely, but is born again. So hell exists, but it only exists as an attachment to the negative karma for the most part. There is a punishment aspect, but it's because of the attachment to the things that have been done. So there are hells, but they're temporary. Are there heavens? Yes. There are heavenly realms, there are realms of existence in other worlds, other dimensions. In Mahayana Buddhism, there is a particular name of a Buddha, and we'll get to it, so hold on for a moment. And this Buddha is known as the Celestial Buddha, the Buddha of all these other dimensions or places, so that if you go to a heavenly place, that is the Buddha you're encountering. It allows for the notion that some of these heavenly places can exist as a respite from the wheel of samsara, not unlike the concepts of heavens in Hinduism. In some places, there are realms for rewards for having good karma. In some areas, they're just another realm of existence, not unlike Earth, for a person or don't need to use the word person, but for the thing we call a person to experience and learn so that they can eventually achieve nirvana. All right, so there's a lot of different ways to approach Buddhism. And one of the best ways is to try and look back at the life of Siddhartha, because understanding his life can actually help us begin to grasp some of these concepts. So can anyone tell me, who was Siddhartha? What caste was he from? Who was he born to? Anybody know? What caste? Because he was born Hindu.
Was he like very wealthy?
Yeah, so he's a noble warrior. And his father is said to have been king. There's a lot of neat little stories about the birth process, the early life of Siddhartha. Everything from his mother having been visited by an elephant-headed deity predicting that she would give birth. Stories that he caused no pain to his mother during the birthing process, that he immediately was able to speak and walk and talk and all these different things. But there's one common thread throughout all the different stories. His father, essentially king, is told your son will either be a great warrior king or a Buddha, an enlightened one. What do you think his father wants for him? Wants him to be a great warrior king. So he's going to make sure his son has a life of pleasure and leisure, of wealth and prosperity, all these wonderful goals that existed in Hinduism, essentially. A little less focus on moksha because that could make him question things, but everything else would be given to him. His father would build essentially a wall around the compound of the home and the homes of a handful of other people. Siddhartha would grow up seeing people who were well off, who were youthful, vibrant, didn't really get sick. He didn't really see many problems. He was given the most beautiful wife in the country. It is said that he also had many female attendants, that his father ensured that he would want for nothing. Except, now technically it starts a little bit early, considering that usually in Hinduism, one wouldn't go into the retirement stage until the children were fully grown. But it's only when Siddhartha is about 27 or so years old that he begins to want to see outside of the main area. Now, some stories will tell you it was one trip he took. Some stories will tell you it was 4 trips he took. So it just depends on which version of the story you read. The idea, though, was that his father was actually going to allow him to go on a particular route. We'll just do that. So he was supposed to go in a charioteer on a particular route. The thing is, his charioteer, who there are some stories that talk about this charioteer having not been a normal man early on in the stories, but he took him off the main path because Siddhartha saw things in the distance. His father had tried to make sure that when he left that main housing area, he wouldn't see anything problematic. But he did. Can anybody tell me what is the first thing that Siddhartha saw? Yes. An old man. So how many of you, on a daily basis, interact with people over the age of 80? Wow. Usually I have at least 1 or 2 people who are in nursing or... All right. So nobody here really interacts on a daily basis with somebody over the age of 80. How many movie stars, TV stars, pop culture people that you follow on Instagram are over the age of 80? well, maybe Betty White or George Takei, William Shatner. That's about it. And even they don't have the notoriety they did, say, 10 years ago. Even Florida, with its stereotypical, generalized, slightly inaccurate statement, home of the newlywed and the nearly dead, we still don't interact with people over the age of 80 that often. Now, the reason I say people over the age of 80, Siddhartha obviously had seen that his dad had gotten older. We can't deny that he saw age take place. But he had never seen somebody so old that they could not walk on 2 feet. The man had a walking cane. He was hunched over. He had no visible sign of life left. His skin wrinkled. He asked his charioteer, "What is this?" "This is old age." "Why did this happen?" "It happens to everybody." "How do we prevent it?" "We can't." What's the second thing he sees? Sick man. Obviously, he had to get a cold or the flu or something at some point. He had to have seen people be somewhat sick. But that's not the type of sickness he saw. Unless you work with people who have stage 4 cancer or in like burn wards or certain parts of the world, you're not going to really see the type of sickness he saw. He most likely saw a leper. Somebody, and I apologize for the description, but it helps to understand the shock that it caused him. Wounds that were weeping and oozing. Disgusting things, even for us to think about today. It's something he'd never ever seen before. What is this? Sickness. Can happen to anyone. It happens to everyone. There's no way to prevent it. What's the third thing he sees? Dead body. Here is where the two main versions of the story are quite different. And it's hard to say which one's the more accurate version because the story that gets depicted is often that he sees a body that is wrapped and being taken to a funeral pyre. But the other story gives a harsher depiction of the type of death he saw. He saw a dead body on the ground, not being attended to. No sign of life left. Deserted by everyone. So there's a slight difference in the story, whether, in both cases though, he saw death. He'd never seen death before. What is this? It's death. It just happened to everyone. Can you prevent it? No. Unless you've worked in certain parts of critical care, or really, to be honest, unless you've worked in the poorest regions of the U.S., third world countries, natural disasters, you haven't quite experienced what Siddhartha did. It shocked him. Ask somebody who's been in the military, ask somebody who starts working at a hospice or starts working in a critical care unit. It changes who they are because they're confronted with something that is not part of our typical modern lives. Even if we don't live in a secluded area away from much of the pain and suffering in the world, we still don't see all the types of pain and suffering there is. And to have it shown to you quickly is a shock. He saw a fourth thing though. What was the fourth person he saw? A monk, a sannyasi. This person is trying to seek a life away from suffering. This person is trying to understand. So Siddhartha joins the ashram. Remember, we're talking Buddhism, so it's ashram. He becomes a wandering renunciate, actually. And of the group that actually performs the extreme ascetics, meaning ideally you don't accept food from people. You find it. And if you do accept it, you don't accept it from women. Because the story says that he was at a well and somebody offered him some food, some drink, and he took it. And some of the people he was with kind of got frustrated. And he had had enough. So he makes a vow that he's going to sit under the bo tree until he understands the meaning of life, understands suffering. So he goes and he sits under that tree for roughly 40 days, 40 nights. One of the first things that happens is a demon known as Mara comes and torments him. Mara tempts him with 3 sons and 3 daughters that represent lust, temptation, food, heaven. If you but give up your quest, I will give you all these things. You will have all this wealth. I'll give you all this other type of knowledge. I'll give you access to a heavenly realm. But you must give up quest. Buddha defeats all of the temptations. Over the course of days and nights, he meditates to higher and higher levels, to a point where he sees all the world and all existence. He gets a chance to see all of his previous incarnations. And he rises higher and higher to where he is at a summit, it is described as, where he peers out now with the Buddha eyes and sees all the world. Suffering. He can go right now. He can go straight into nirvana. He can just go. Nothing really stopping him. He hesitates. Essentially. He understands it all now. But he opens completely his Buddha eyes. And he sees that there are some people whose eyes are only partially shut. He contemplates it. Then he remembers the vow he took, not just under the bo tree, but the vow he took when he became a renunciate, that he would help, that he would serve, that he would live with compassion and love. And so he decided to stay and not go immediately into nirvana. And thus began the ministry of the Buddha. He had the opportunity to leave, but he sacrificed immediate entry into nirvana that he might help others. The thing is, who were these others? Because there were 2 groups of people. There were those that still lived in the domain of the senses. But then there were those monks that he had traveled with, the ascetics. So he had a message to both of them. These foolish people who torment themselves, as well as those who have become attached to the domain of the senses, both of these should be viewed as faulty in their method. They are not the way to deathlessness. These so-called austerities but confuse the mind, which is overpowered by the body's exhaustion. In the resulting stupor, one can no longer understand the ordinary things of life, how much less the way to truth which lies beyond the senses. The minds of those, on the other hand, so all the people who are attached to the domain of the senses, worthless sense objects, are overwhelmed by passion and darkening delusion. They lose even the method which, by suppressing the passion, leads to dispassion. So I have given up both of these extremes and have found another path, a middle way. It leads to the appeasing of all ill, and yet it is free from happiness. So Siddhartha didn't call his path Buddhism. He called it the middle way. It became known as Buddhism in the decades following Siddhartha. The people who started following him would become known as arhats, fully liberated beings, beings who upon their death would be able to go to nirvana. They would form communities known as sanghas. So the ashram is the community in Hinduism. The sangha is the community in Buddhism. When one becomes a member of the sangha, a monk, etc., but even the regular layperson will recite something known as the three jewels, or the triple gem. So it's, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. Now, Dharma has a different meaning in Buddhism. In Hinduism, Dharma was the duties, responsibilities. In Buddhism, Dharma is the teachings of Siddhartha. So it's I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. So when you do go, whether it's the Thai temple, whether it is any Buddhist temple, and you see people who prostrate themselves 3 times in front of the Buddha, that is them reciting the triple gem. When there are festivals and there's parades around temples, they go around the temple 3 times to recall the triple gem. Now, Siddhartha realized there are 4 noble truths. The first truth is what? All life is suffering, pain, bitterness, anxiety, frustration. What is suffering caused by? Desire. I want to have the newest phone, and I'm suffering because I don't have it. So I get the newest phone, but now I'm like, oh no, I can't drop it. I gotta make sure I have an OtterBox or something else to protect my phone. I'm still anxious, even though I now have what I had desired. I want somebody to love, and I don't have someone. Wow, I got them. Now I have somebody to love, but now I'm scared of losing them, or I'm scared of somebody else trying to take them, or I'm still suffering. You're sick, you want to be well. You're well, you don't want to get sick. It's a constant cycle. The Dalai Lama, he does a great little talk where he says, I have a check for $1 million. That $1 million will not bring inner happiness and peace. More anxiety, more frustration, more jealousy. People who you thought were your friends might not seem like they're your friends, and people you didn't even know all of a sudden say they're your friends when you get that $1 million check. So it's a constant cycle. But the third truth tells us there can be an end to desire. What is the fourth truth?
The way to know is the Eightfold Path.
Eightfold Path, Rightfold Path. That's one way to remember it, because every part of the Eightfold Path starts with the word right. So eightfold, rightfold. One question you'll have will be to determine whether a couple things belong to the Eightfold Path or the 10 precepts. If it starts with the word right, it belongs to the Eightfold Path. Now, in your textbooks, it goes a little bit more into detail. But right views means we understand those 4 noble truths. Right thought, we're able to focus our thought away from the negative, away from harm. Right speech. We will not engage in gossip and frivolous lies and these things. We will speak the truth with honesty and sincerity. Right action. The action we take should be action that is away from causing harm. Our action should be filled with love and compassion and bring peace. Bring karuna, compassion. Right livelihood. The work I do should not be causing harm. I should work in a field that promotes those concepts of karuna or compassion, of peace. and of teaching the Dharma. Interestingly, the right livelihood in certain countries at various points in history has posed a huge problem. In China, for instance, every youth could be conscripted into the military. It didn't matter whether you were Taoist or Confucian or Buddhist, you would be conscripted into the military. So there was a lot of challenges at times to understand how to look at right livelihood, how to understand that if your job does cause harm, how can you balance it? How can you try and still work to remain Buddhist? The last three focus more on dhyana, or meditation. Here we have right mindfulness, right thought, right mindfulness, right effort, and right concentration. The effort lies in the notion of clearing one's thoughts away from the distractions, meaning being able to focus your thoughts. You need to focus on studying for a test, so you have to learn how to focus on studying for the test and not checking Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or something. It means being able to have the effort to control your breath, control your thoughts, control your senses. Mindfulness tends to be both the awareness and then the detachment of that awareness. And then right concentration is the deeper levels of meditation, which are what most people tend to think of that is, oh, you're meditating on nothingness, I can't do that. My mind has too many thoughts. Right concentration is usually considered a deeper level. You really don't go immediately to that. You start with notions of right effort. You start with notions of right mindfulness before delving into the deeper practices. In general, the variances of the order include the idea of morality in speech and action, dhyana, meditation, and insight, wisdom. All right, we're going to come back to the next little bit in a moment. So I mentioned there are 10 precepts. The precepts are the prohibits. So precepts, prohibits, eightfold, rightfold. Depending on form of Buddhism, there will be between 5 and 10 precepts. Most textbooks today will focus only on the first 5 because they tend to be the most universal. But traditionally, the sanghas, the actual communities of Buddhism, would have some understanding of all 10. So there's the idea that the lay people have the primary 5 in one way, and monks would have the 5 in a different understanding and possibly more. So the first 5, prohibition against taking life. If you see the memes or the images of the Buddhist precepts, this usually says, do not murder. But it is best translated as prohibition against taking life. What does that mean? Well, it does mean do not murder. For some Buddhists, it means do not kill anyone, meaning animals. So they might be vegetarian because they follow this precept. Yes?
Does that include like yourself?
Mm-hmm. We'll talk a little bit about that because there's also Buddhists who do commit suicide.
Is it, murder anything with eyes or something? Does that have something to do with the eyes? Am I thinking of something else?
You're thinking of something a little bit different. Not completely. Buddhism is so vast. It's sort of like Christianity where you can describe a ritual and it's true for one group, but there's other groups, even under the same quote denominational name, that practice very different. Even those temples in Burma, you go to a different temple, you see a different depiction, you see different color schemes, you see different images that depict how, in this region of the world, this is how Buddhism is practiced. But you go 30 miles away, they're going to do it a little bit differently because of the groups that made up the the culture. With Buddhism is where we really begin to see how geography can impact religious beliefs and practices. Because you have one group of people merging with another group, or one group of people's beliefs spreading to another area. All right, number 2, prohibition against taking what is not given. Most simply stated as do not steal. Prohibition against sexual misconduct. Most aptly interpreted and written as do not commit adultery. However, that really is not just summarizing it, but narrowing it down to only one aspect. Between lay people and monks, there's different understandings and meanings of what sexual misconduct means. Traditionally speaking, sexual misconduct includes homosexuality. It includes any sex that is not with the appropriate person at the appropriate time. There are technically rules in Buddhism that tell you what time of the day, what time of the week, month, year, etc. is best, what positions you should have or use. Technically, those exist in Buddhism. Mostly sexual misconduct, though, today for lay people does come across as do not commit adultery. Interestingly, with regards to homosexuality, Hinduism has always accepted that there is a place for homosexuality, provided one is still meeting their dharma. So it's really interesting, that view in Hinduism. In Buddhism, it was historically prohibited. Even as recently as the 2000s, you have where the Dalai Lama speaking to Buddhist monks and Buddhist lay people talked about how for the lay people, homosexuality is forbidden. On the level of the monks, depends on the form of Buddhism, majority of monks in Buddhism, when they are monks, it is a celibate life. So for some forms, though, it actually goes a little bit further than just celibacy, generally speaking, no sex with another person. There are some orders of monks where even taking care of oneself could be grounds to be either removed or put down to a lower level of monkhood, because it is supposed to be a complete refraining from any sexual anything. It just depends on which community of monks and which form of Buddhism you look at. Prohibition against lying, that goes right in hand with the Eightfold Path, right speech. The next one is even though sexual misconduct can be complicated, the more you look into it, like I said, generally the idea of no adultery is accepted. Prohibition of taking of intoxicants has a much wider interpretation, because intoxicants can mean any type of drug, any type of thing that can alter the mind or body in a way that was not natural, or even a way that is natural. Some Buddhists, whether we're looking at lay people or monks, will say they won't take anything artificial, whether it's a sugar, whether it's a salt, whether it's anything, no artificial, because anything that is artificial is toxic. Or they won't have coffee, because caffeine can be seen as a toxin. You have different understandings of what intoxicants can be. It can be alcohol. That's usually one of the interpretations is, prohibition against alcohol. For a large percentage of monks and a good percentage of even lay Buddhists, it means no narcotics, which means different types of drugs that you would see in a hospice would be forbidden. No morphine, for instance. No Demerol, no Vicodin, because these things can alter the mind. The idea is that in death, you're supposed to be as clear-minded as you can be going into death, even if you're not part of the Tibetan Buddhists with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's still this importance throughout most all Buddhist traditions of that clarity. Other forms of Buddhism, though, the prohibition of intoxicants is very relaxed. Tantric Buddhism, there are offshoots of Tantric Buddhism where using natural items, so nothing artificial, but using natural funguses that might grow, or different types of items that grow on the ground, and using those to have a altered state is done within a certain ritual rules and everything. It's not quote pleasure, but it's done as a way to understand that process versus the process of getting there through meditation. Very different than most other forms of Buddhism. And not all Tantric Buddhism does that, only some. But it's interesting to see this wide variety of interpretation. So the last 5, usually the lay Buddhist is not going to follow them, and every community might pick or choose on some of these. Prohibition against eating after noon. In Tibetan Buddhism, they're usually not supposed to eat after 11 a.m. The video we watched the last day of class talks about how the Dalai Lama wakes up at 3 a.m. to rush to breakfast because it will be his only meal of the day. There are different groups. Some will say no eating after about 1 o'clock. Most Thai Buddhism, it's around 1 o'clock is the shut-off. Some monks, it will be only on certain days that they don't eat afternoon. It really depends on the community and what their rules are. Prohibition against participating in dancing, singing, and shows. Traditionally, a monk would not show up on America's Got Talent or one of their shows. That being said, Tantric Buddhists do have displays of Tantric dance. You can also see the Tibetan Tantric dance style. You have the idea that mandalas are now done as public displays. So what this means usually is tied to the idea of frivolity and the intent behind what you're doing. You should not be desiring of attention. You should not be desiring of notoriety, because such things put you in that cycle of suffering and desire. Because then what happens if a fan says, oh, if somebody comes back and is trolling your Instagram feed, maybe you don't want to be popular after all, because that can be a stressful thing. But it's that idea of suffering and desire and trying to move away from it. Prohibition against adorning oneself with garlands, perfumes, and ointments. Other than one's prayer beads, and technically even the prayer beads and even the linens used for the robes, technically are not the belongings of the monk, traditionally, but those are about the only things that they will have. Different forms of Buddhism might also have flags, the singing bowls, there's different items, but they're not really going to decorate themselves with jewelry. For the most part, they're not going to wear garlands, perfumes. Some students in the past have asked, does this mean they don't wear deodorant? Well, interestingly, a lot of monks from Asia would not be wearing deodorant traditionally. They also wouldn't necessarily need it the way that people who, well, have a SAD, standard American diet, would need it. Because when you get rid of certain types of foods, it does tend to change the odor and the smell of the body. That being said, I know plenty of monks who will use deodorants and other things regularly, so again, that variety. The next one's interesting. Prohibition against sleeping in a soft bed. Sorry, no 1,000 count, thread count sheets. Traditionally, monks will sleep either on mats or cots that might be either on the ground or in an area of the temple or outside the temple area. Different communities have different standards. Yes, when the Dalai Lama travels, he stays in 4-star hotels, and yes, he is sleeping on the beds when he travels. Usually a question I get is, wait, does that mean when he travels he sleeps on the floor instead of on the bed on the hotel? No. But in Gamapala, where he lives in India, he actually sleeps on a mat. Prohibition against receiving gold and silver. Yes, your local temple needs your donations and support. However, individual monks are not allowed to own property or to receive any type of compensation purely for themselves. Even in Theravada Buddhism, known as the Buddhism of the begging monk, where the monks go around and the purpose they're receiving gifts primarily of food, but of other items as well. What's given to the monk isn't necessarily for the monk, it's for the sangha, it's for the community. Vehicles that are owned by communities are just that. They're usually owned by the community, not by the individual monk. If it is owned by the individual monk, it's usually the lead or the head monk, in which case it's only because that is the monk of that particular community, and technically is still not considered property of the individual. Again, these things vary across different sanghas, different communities, different people. All right, for next class, you have a challenge. And I will rewrite the challenge as an announcement as well, because for my online students, this is a discussion they actually get into. You need to write on a sheet of paper. You have to answer a question for me. And you have, well, technically there's two questions, but ideally you're going to try and answer the first question. The first question is merely this. Who are you? Who are you? Now, there's two rules to this question, though, and two rules to your answer. So, question is, who are you? First rule, it has to describe you only. Nobody else, living or dead. So, I'm sorry, but somebody, even as unique as you think your name is, somebody else, living or dead,
So-
might have your same
And
name.
then I cannot say I'm Puerto Rican either, right?
Nope. Whatever your religion is, whatever your description like that, if somebody else can answer the same way, it doesn't work. It has to be you and only you. All right, second rule. It has to be the same from birth to death, meaning it can't change in meaning or application. So, for instance, you might be the only child of your parents. Okay. But what it meant to be a child of your parents is different now than it was when you were a few days old and they were changing your diapers. What it means to be a child, what it means to be a parent changes. So your answer has to be something that fits you and only you and has not changed in meaning, in definition, from the moment you were born, and will not change all the way up to the moment you die.
Can you do an example?
No. I cannot give an example. Now, here's the thing. If you first attempt this, so this is your main question. If you attempt that and you can't come up with something, then the second question is the main one you need to answer, which is why? Using the textbook. So using the textbook, you need to be able to tell me why you could not answer question one. So you either need to answer question one, or tell me why you couldn't answer it using your textbook.
I'm already.
I'm already, yeah.
Now, there's one final thing I just want you to ponder, and that's all. You just need to think about it because it will help you to not have anxiety or anything thinking about it on Thursday. I want you to think about what a tree is.
A tree?
A tree. Yeah. Actually, two things. What a tree? Well, yeah, I'll just leave it as a tree for now. Just what is a tree? That's it. So answer this question on a sheet of paper. We will have the discussion about it at the beginning of class, and then also think about the question, what is a tree? Questions, comments, concerns?
I think I know what I got now.
This question really helps people understand a couple of concepts in Buddhism better than anything. I have a whole list of different ways to approach some of the concepts in Buddhism, but year after year, this one always proved to be the best, and now this is only approach I use to help. Technically, there is one other part which is what is shared, but that's better than the unusual.
Like me to bring my singing bowl and flat?
Yes, I'll be bringing my singing bowls. We can have a singing bowl event.
You don't have to hang our flags and mark. In line for honoring her, even if it's not the spider and flags.
You're not supposed to, but
I mean, it's,
do you know the answer, Faraj?
I can come up with a lot of different.
I know what you're getting at. I know.
I can come up with a lot of philosophy, but I will just be.
The answer is actually very simple. You can use one of
I have my own.
3 answers for number 2 that are like one-word answers, and you'd get it.
Because I'm unique.
With number 1, there's a couple of really good answers.
I'm gonna think about it.
So, yeah. But with doing part 2, you need to explain. You don't just need to give me the word. You need to explain using the textbook. It's the opposite of Atman.
Oh, I just wanted to, I don't know if you responded back, but I just wanted to let you know that.
You'll be out Thursday.
Yeah, is there, what
Okay,
are we doing
so
so I can study?
Thursday,
Yes.
we're going to talk about no self.
Okay.
The idea that there is no soul. There's no unchanging interior entity inside you. Meaning, number 1 is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, it's the fact that you are constantly changing. And then the rest of it will be just going through with the workbook. So
Okay. And I'll do the workbook
yeah,
and read
and
the
I
chapters.
should have. I think the setup is now working again, so I should be able to have the lecture recorded and up on Canvas.
Oh, I can find them on.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
I record all the lectures because even though I have lectures from previous terms, I really prefer my online students to get the most current lectures
Mhm.
because things change sometimes, and I always do my quizzes based off what's happening in class.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Thank you. That makes sense.
yeah.
But
Well,
I'll still
I
send
hate
it.
having questions on the quiz that we in no way have